Yeah, could I just interject something here? Ralph Greenspan was talking to me at one of the breaks about the issue of reducibility, exactly how reducible is human behavior to these kind of notions and so on. I was thinking about, we mentioned yesterday, there's a book, a fairly well-known book by Andrew Brown called The Darwin Wars, which is the scientific battle for man's battle for the scientific battle for the soul, I think. And it tells the story, at least in part, of Bill Hamilton, who really wrote some of the equations that are about inclusive fitness that lead you to a concept of altruism. And another man called George Price, who reworked checked some of, correct me if I'm wrong on this, corrected Bill Hamilton's equations, and was in fact, in a curious sense, so devastated by the fact that you could get altruism out of this situation that it paradoxically removed from him the capacity to do anything good of his own will. It was a rather strange irony. I think I've got that approximately right. And he actually ended up committing suicide. Yeah. There were all sorts of other reasons, but I'm getting to the reducibility issue here, that the equations, in a sense, took away what he seemed to see was his capacity to be good.
Well, that's right. I mean, he was a very tragic figure. I never knew him, but my understanding is that the thing that really, really drove him to depression was the discovery that, as he thought, there was no basis for goodness. I mean, he was an extraordinarily good and generous man who drove himself to penury. He gave everything he had to beggars and tramps that he met in the streets, and ended up, sleeping under a sack. He was a most extraordinary man. He was very, very religious. He was a Christian. One anecdote that Maynard Smith tells, but he also collaborated with Maynard Smith on the game theory. The evolutionary game theory, the evolutionarily stable strategy, and they coined a game called Hawks and Doves, which was a sort of paradigm game to understand how aggression and cooperation might evolve. But Price vetoed the use of the word dove because he thought it was a sin against the Holy Ghost, and so that's why in the original Maynard Smith and Price paper, Nature 1973. Dove is replaced by mouse. It's hawks and mice, and this was Price's religious scruples preventing him from using the word dove for this purely symbolic mathematical purpose.
But on the reducibility issue, the larger issue, Ralph, do you want to actually expand on that a little?
Ralph Greenspan, Neurosciences Institute. What I was thinking about as part of the discussions this morning has to do with making different degrees of distinctions, because the question came up: can there be such a thing as a science of morality? And that has to do with the issue of reducibility, and without necessarily saying that religion has to be part of it, one can still be entirely a materialist and yet believe that not everything can be absolutely reduced to, in a narrow sense, to a totally specifiable scientific explanation, in the sense that there can be domains within which things will happen where you can't say exactly how they're going to happen, but you can say what the boundary condition within which it might happen. And so as an example of that, a biological example of that would be the complex behavior of some biological networks, where because of their degeneracy, there are multiple ways of getting the same output. And one cannot say necessarily a priori exactly which way it will come out, although a posteriori you in principle could trace how it actually happened. It's a thoroughly materialistic view of the world without necessarily being one that is entirely reducible to a specifically predictable set of events.
Well, I'm not sure you mean reducible. You mean predictable, don't you?
Well, that's the way. When I say reducible, it just has to do with a colloquial use of the word. What do some people mean by it versus others? But yes, so that there can be certain severe limits to predictability without something necessarily having to be attributed to a non-materialist cause.
I don't think I have any problem with that.
No, of course.
What I would have a problem with would be somebody who said that it might follow from what you've just said, that therefore we have to invoke an immaterial cause. And there are many people who would be only too gleefully tempted to do that.
Right, but so when I brought this up with Roger, what I was responding to was the point of view that has been expressed at several times during this conference of the notion that there could be a scientifically specifiable program to deal with things like morality in social interactions. And I don't think that.
No, well,
and that's, I think, an extreme position in terms of how scientifically describable something like morality is.
Well, if you're asking me whether I think science can contribute to morality, I would say science could certainly contribute to our understanding of where morality comes from in our psychology, and that's in a small way what I tried to do today. And I think also, I think somebody else made this point yesterday, if not science itself, the sort of scientific, rational language and method of reasoning, as used by moral philosophers, for example, who can't actually tell you what's right and wrong, but you can show you using the scientific style of reasoning that if you believe that so-and-so is wrong and so-and-so is wrong at the same time, then you're being inconsistent. And that may be non-obvious until you've done the rational analysis.
Dan Siegel.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dan Siegel from UCLA. This is actually a question for the last two speakers, Professor Dawkins and Professor Banaji, and I don't know where she is. Hi. It takes a developmental perspective on the two presentations that you both gave, which is the whole sense that we've evolved as mammals, and particularly as primates, to have a sense of belonging. And certainly from an individual point of view of a child being connected to a family, you see this sense of, at first, belonging to that unit and then finding a larger culture in which you belong, et cetera. And so what can we say about that notion of being a member of a group to which you belong and religion? And how can we see then, what do people, for example, in the United States have as an alternative when they get out into the larger world? Where do they belong? Where do they have a sense of connection to a larger community through which they can find a way to feel meaning and to live?
I suppose it would be right to say that one could also come up with a Darwinian account for why people feel a need to belong. In our history, if I'm right, that we lived in baboon-like groups, you not only would have had a tendency to be nice to people, but also you'd have had a tendency to identify members of your group and to be perhaps xenophobic, prejudiced against members of other groups, to show a desire to retain the integrity of the group, to work for the good of the group. All these things in Darwin himself came as close as he ever came to a group selection point of view when he was talking about human groups. So, yes, I think there probably is a plausible Darwinian account that one could give for a kind of in-group welfare, out-group hostility tendency that we might all have, and which again might manifest itself in the form of misfirings or mistakes in a completely new and changed world.